my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Guys, I got to make a confession here. I have joined a cult. Or I guess I should rather say I have rejoined a cult because just thought I should let you guys know I use Arch Linux, by the way. And you can't see it, but my neofetch shows that I am running perfectly vanilla Arch. None of that Manjaro or Arco Arch or any of those other derivatives of Arch. I am using vanilla Arch. So I just thought I would let y'all know that I am using Arch Linux, by the way. I have also, well, I say rejoined because I've used Arch in the past, but I just thought I would bring that up because, of course, as being a user of Arch Linux, you are therefore required to broadcast to everyone the fact that you use Arch Linux. Now, we're going to get into more about Linux and Arch Linux later on in this episode, but I just thought, that'd be kind of funny to open with. But let the record show that while I do technically use Arch Linux, I also use Ubuntu, Debian, Kali, RedHat, CentOS, Raspbian, Alpine, and I might be missing one or two others, but those are other distros I use, and that's not even to mention ones I have used previously, such as like Linux Mint or, I'm trying to think of some others that I've used recently. Elementary, Pop OS. I've tried a lot of different ones. Garuda. There's a ton that I've tried. So, yeah. But anyway, let's get into this week's trivia question. So this week's trivia question is, what C++ revision was the file system library first introduced into the standard C++ library? So what was the revision? I'm specifically looking for a year, although if you give me like revision, 1 or 3 or 2 or, whatever that, I guess that works too. But I'm specifically looking for the year. So that would be like 2011, 2017, 1998, 2020, something like that. So what was the year that the file system library was first introduced into the standard library for C++? So that is your trivia question for the week. Now, if you guys remember back to last week's episode, you will recall that I talked about some cheesing that I did to the AI in Pokemon Scarlet. Well, the cheese, there was more cheese this week. I'll just say that there was a lot more cheese. So I was playing it again, and let's just say the AI made not a very smart move. And mind you, I was in the Elite Four at the time when the AI made this move. And the Elite Four, for those of you who don't play Pokemon, are supposed to be like the cream of the crop, the top tier, the toughest of the tough, the most challenging battles that you have. And I still managed to cheese them. So basically what happened was one of the Elite Four members was a Steel type, and I had out a Fighting type. Now, Fighting is super effective against Steel, so obviously I have the advantage here. Now, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet introduced a new mechanic, a new battle gimmick, if you will, as all the previous few generations have, and this gimmick is called terrestrialization, which basically means that you can transform the type of your Pokemon into a different type, but you can only do it, I believe it's only once per battle, and you have to heal that Pokemon before you can use it on them again. I don't necessarily know all the specifics. Personally, I've never used it because I kind of find it kind of pointless, sort of. Plus, the main Pokemon that I use on my team, they're terrestrialization or their Terra type is basically the same as what their type is anyway, so I don't really see much of a point in using it to begin with, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, the Pokemon they sent out was a Fairy Steel type, which is neutral against my fighting type. But of course, the AI had to show off their amazing genius. Well, really, they were just showing off the battle mechanic. So they terrestrialized into a pure steel type. And then, of course, I was planning on using a fighting type move because I knew that's what they were going to do. And sure enough, they did that. And then I hit them with the super effective fighting move and took them out. So that was pretty funny. So yeah, granted, I get this is a kid's game. Obviously, it's generalized and, marketed towards kids. So it shouldn't be too hard. And obviously, they got to show off the new feature for the new battle mechanics and whatnot. So I get all that. But because I know that, I'm able to therefore exploit the AI and take advantage of it. And speaking of exploits, that is, I think, a great segue into talking about this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, I kind of mentioned previously going about exploits. One thing that I think this should probably go without saying is make sure that you're always up to date on your OS's latest security updates. And the reason why this is obviously important is because putting aside software or system updates, like any kind of software you have, anytime there's a security update, you should be installing it. And the reason for that is because the reason why security updates get pushed is because generally there's a CVE found or something, which if you're not familiar with what CVEs are, they're basically, it's kind of like a database where it has a bunch of vulnerabilities for different forms of software, and if you're patching for a certain CVE, you're basically patching it out so that exploit or vulnerability or crash or whatever can no longer be used against the program or operating system or whatever the case may be. So the reason why you want to install your security updates is because if you don't, your software, operating system, whatever, is vulnerable to those kinds of attacks, vulnerabilities, exploits, whatever the case may be. Now, one thing when we're talking about software updates is feature updates specifically, you might want to hold back on those. And the reason I say that is because as much testing that goes into, software before it gets pushed to the public, you can't find all the bugs, right? And generally when there's a big new feature update, that's a ton of new features that have never been tested. Well, they might have been tested in the wild depending on the flow of the company, how the company distributes software. They might have some kind of beta testing program, but even that would be limited. So the software wouldn't be like way out there in the wild for everyone using and testing and all that good stuff. So if you have a new feature update, that's a ton of new features that hasn't been widely tested against the broader audience and hasn't had eyes on from, everyone from attackers to cybersecurity analysts if the software is an open source. So there's more potential that if a feature update comes out, there could potentially be more vulnerabilities baked in there versus, say, some operating system or some piece of software that the only updates it's received in the past few months have been like security updates, because the one that's only gotten security updates recently, that software has been more tested and been through the rigor and had more eyes on it and more people trying to break it and has been patched and fixed and whatnot. Whereas a new feature update it's just completely untested, which is kind of always funny when you'll see, software version releases, and generally the feature updates are a something 0.0, and then it's always kind of funny to see how quickly the 0.1 comes out after the 0.0 comes out, because there was some kind of vulnerability or bug found in the feature update. And this is also why you'll see, especially in like the enterprise world and the business world, their software is always old. It's they're almost never running like the latest and greatest. And that's in part because they want the stability and they want the security. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're still running the security updates in most cases, but they're not installing all the latest and greatest feature updates. And the reason, obviously, they're doing that, kind of like we mentioned, they want to make sure that those features that are being added are properly vetted from any kind of vulnerabilities or bugs or crashes or anything like that, to make sure that they can have, maximum uptime and limited downtime, and make sure that try to limit their attack surface and mitigate any kind of chance of them getting hacked in that regard. So while as fun as it is to update to the latest feature updates, or potentially even getting ahead of that and going to beta programs, I definitely cannot recommend, especially beta or any kind of beta software or even alpha software, which is like before beta. I cannot recommend running that on whatever your main computer is. Now, if you want to play around with it in like a virtual machine or on a test device or something like that, by all means, knock yourself out. But to make sure that that your system is as secure as possible and, less likely to be vulnerable to any kind of attacks or anything like that, probably want to hold off on updating to any kind of latest feature updates, at least for depending on the software vendor. Now, if it's like a Microsoft or an Apple or Linux or anything like that, you're probably fine updating to the latest feature update after a couple weeks or so, because at that point, chances are any of the major problems with it would have been discovered by then and patched. So if you wait a couple weeks to a month, then you're probably good to go. But then obviously, anytime there's a security update that gets pushed to you, definitely want to be updating that as soon as possible. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So as you can see, just making sure that your software is up to date goes a lot deeper than just making sure that your software is up to date. Now, before we get into the nerdy stuff I did this week, which is talking about Arch Linux, I want to talk about some non-nerdy stuff I did, which I think is kind of sad in a way. So it's kind of getting to be that year. At least in the United States, for any of my international listeners. I'm not sure what it's like for you guys, but for us here in the U.S., tax season is almost upon us. So this week I did my taxes, and obviously doing taxes is, I don't think anyone enjoys doing their taxes. I think the only people that enjoy doing their taxes or doing taxes in general are accountants, tax software providers, or basically anyone that makes money off of people doing their taxes, essentially. The government probably loves tax season when people are doing their taxes, except in some cases when they have to give people money back because they took too much. But they probably get a lot of money anyway, so it's probably a net positive for them. Anyway, was it fun for me doing my taxes? Obviously not. It wasn't really that enjoyable. But you might be wondering why I bring this up. And if you're thinking I brought this up because I had this grand idea to create my own tax software, that's like free and it's on my GitHub right now. As cool as that would be, one, I don't have time for that. Two, I'm not a tax professional. And because I'm not a tax professional, there's a very high likelihood I would mess something up, and you could potentially be in trouble on your taxes, get audited or something. I don't know. I'm not about to be liable for that. So no, I did not do that. As cool as that would be, I did not. But the reason I brought it up was, for as dreaded and terrible as it is, I gotta say, guys, compared to doing schoolwork, it was kind of a blast. I'm not gonna lie. I would happily do my taxes again and not have to do schoolwork. So if anyone out there listening wants to do my homework for me and I can do your taxes, I might consider it. But joking aside, the reason I think why in general people don't really like filing their taxes is because in an ideal world, at least according to financial advisors, which I am not, by the way, so obviously don't take any of this as financial advice, but from what I've heard listening and talking to them, in the ideal world, you don't get any money back and you don't have to pay any money. So it's really just one of those things that's a nuisance that you have to do because otherwise you go to jail. And going to jail, I have not been, but I hear it is not fun. So you don't want to go. So the only way to not go is to do your taxes. But aside from the going to jail point, there really is no incentive to do it because in the ideal world, you're not getting any money back. And it's not like there's any detriment to it because, again, in the ideal world, you're not paying money. Although, obviously, this is not an ideal world, and generally one of those two happens. But the reason why they say that you shouldn't get any money back or you shouldn't have to pay any money is because if you're getting money back, that means the government they taxed you too much, and now you're getting money back, and that would have been money that you could have been getting throughout the year. And the reason why it's bad if you have to pay money is because that means you're just a greedy capitalist pig that didn't pay their fair share during the year, and now you have to pay up. But joking aside, let's look at an example to break this down. So for easy numbers, let's just say you get a tax refund because refunds are better than having to pay money. But say you get a tax refund of $2,400, which that sounds really good. But on the other hand, that's $200 a month that you could have been getting but didn't get because the government decided they wanted to take it from you. Now, why this is kind of a big deal, at least from the financial advisor's point of view, is because the financial advisor would tell you, again, this is not financial advice, but the financial advisor would tell you you could have invested that $200 extra a month and you would have been better off. So hypothetically, if you put that into some kind of S&P fund, which on average returns about like 10% a year or so, you'd be, by the end of that year, you would actually have around $2,500, so you'd have an extra $100. But again, that's obviously with the assumption that that $200 extra you would have been investing, which, if we're being honest with ourselves, I think I'm not sure you can definitively say that you would have invested that $200 every month and been, you would have made sure you did that. In an ideal world, sure, but this is the real world, and, stuff happens. You have something come up, or you forget, or whatever the case may be. There's a new server on sale, and you gotta splurge, or that just me maybe? Okay. But anyway, let's, if we stretch that out over the course of like 15 years, if you got $200 extra every month, and we're assuming here that you're investing that money and being diligent, you would actually end up with around $80K or so, and 55% or about $44,000 coming from interest. Whereas if you just got that $2,400 and again you invested it just once a year, you would be looking at $76,000, whereas $40,000 coming from interest. So you would have less. And then obviously even less than that if you never invested any of it and you just got the refund, or you just didn't invest anything, that would be $36,000. So all this to say, yada, 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 financial stuff. I'm not a financial advisor, but from their perspective, math works out. And yeah, so, but anyway, all this to say that this is a very long way of saying that there really is no, in an ideal world again, there's no incentive to do taxes. Like, it's not like, oh boy, I can't wait to do my taxes so I can get a big old fat tax refund, because again, like in the ideal world, you realistically shouldn't, at least, according to financial people, but hey, you do you. Anyway, all that aside, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So we started off this episode talking about how I joined the cult of Arch Linux. Now, I say the cult of Arch Linux, will more realistically rejoined, because I have used it in the past a couple of times, but I can't remember if it was the first time I used it, or it might have been the second time. But the reason, it was the second time. The reason I stopped using it when I was using it the second time was because I ran an update and my computer no longer worked. The operating system kind of bricked itself. Now, I thought if I could just kind of keep it along and like plug in like a bootable USB, mount the operating system and run updates that way, it might fix itself. No, it never did. But so that was the reason I stopped using it the last time I used it. But the reason why I say Arch Linux is like a cult, because if you go on any kind of like forums or anywhere online, the Arch Linux community, at least stereotypically, is like the vegan community, stereotypically, of course, where that, of course, being that vegans always feel the need to tell you that they're vegan, just like Arch Linux users always feel the need to tell you that they use Arch. This can be seen on, various forum posts and Reddit threads where they post their neofetch, which is basically, if you're not familiar with neofetch, it basically gives an ASCII art of the operating system you're using, and then like some stats about your computer. And now, granted, you can, and I have fudged it to make it look like you're using a different operating system. So pro tip for anyone out there that wants to make it seem like they're using Arch without actually using Arch, you can just go into like the config file for neofetch and like hard code the operating system. So rather than auto detecting what operating system you're using, you can like hard code it in, and then it'll print the ASCII art to what you want. Since before I found out about the whole free money glitch that I've talked about with RedHat, I had Fedora installed, and I did this exact thing where I wanted to make my Fedora install look exactly like RedHat. Because if you're not familiar, Fedora is not exactly the feature branch of RedHat, but it uses the same package manager as RedHat, and basically all the commands and everything is the same as RedHat. The only difference is Fedora is like way ahead as far as like it's more bleeding edge than RedHat is, since RedHat obviously is geared towards the enterprise, which as we mentioned enterprises like to lag behind a little bit when it comes to the features because they want to make sure everything is secure, everything is stable, all that good stuff. So I want it, but because Fedora, literally anyone can get Fedora. You don't have to go through any hoops of going through making a developer account or anything like that. You can just download Fedora for free and install it. So, but because how similar it is to Red Hat, I wanted to make it look like Red Hat. So I went through the hassle of customizing my neofetch config to make it hard code Red Hat in there, so it would print out Red Hat like I was actually using Red Hat, even though I wasn't. So anyone out there that wants to do that with Arch and pretend like you use it, go ahead, knock yourself out. But the reason why I kind of wanted to bring this up was we've been talking in this episode about software updates and that kind of thing. And Arch Linux it's like Fedora, but even more bleeding edge. Like if you want the latest and greatest everything, Arch is basically the way to go. But another nice thing about Arch is, in addition to how bleeding edge it is, which can be a good and a bad thing, the other good thing about it is how minimalist it is. Because unlike other distros where you install it and it pre-installs a bunch of packages for you, literally the only packages that are installed on Arch are the ones that are literally required for the operating system to run and function. So the packages that are required for the firmware and the operating system and your user interface, if you decide to even install one, or if you just want to go command line only, then you don't even need a user interface. I don't know why I'm blanking on the desktop environment. That's what they call them. So if you install a desktop environment, you'll install the packages that are required for that, but you don't install anything else. So the nice thing about Arch is it can run on pretty low spec hardware because of how lightweight it is in that sense, because literally the only things that are being installed on it are what you want to install. So you could install the base Arch install through a super lightweight desktop environment, and you can run that on a potato. Like I have an old Chromebook that I converted to use the Chromebook the correct way, which is obviously not using Chrome OS, wiping that garbage off of it, or spyware off of it, I guess, and installing Linux on it. And the first thing I tried to install was, I tried a bunch of different distros, and all of them kind of ran like garbage because of, obviously it's a Chromebook and it's super underpowered. So one of my friends recommended that I try to use Arch on there, and that was the first time I ever installed Arch, and that was, not gonna lie, a little difficult since I'd never done it before. But honestly, so I guess I'll take a step back. So if you've never installed Arch Linux before, it's very different than your typical software install. So normally when you install an operating system, you have a user interface that you can kind of click through some menus, maybe do a little bit of customization, like where you want to install. Maybe you partition your drive size, or something like that. Arch is you're in the command line. I'll say that, but it's all command line based. So you got to type all the commands yourself and essentially install the OS yourself. The only thing you don't have to do is you don't have to build the kernel and operating system from source. You don't have to do that, but you're basically one step above that because you have to manually type all the commands to install and configure the operating system yourself, which sounds hard and sounds difficult, But in reality, as long as you can read, it's pretty easy just to follow along the Arch wiki and do the install no problem. Or there's tons of YouTube videos and other online tutorials showing you how to install it. So it's really not that hard, but there's kind of that, I guess, superiority, which maybe adds into the I use Arch Linux, by the way, factor of that superiority of kind of doing it yourself, maybe. But yeah, the reason, but when going back to the Chromebook install, so that worked good and it ran really well. The only problem is because Chromebooks, I don't necessarily think are natively supported. There was a lot of things I had to do post install to configure it to actually work the way I wanted, because if you've ever looked at a Chromebook before, the keyboard layout is not standard to like a normal Windows computer's keyboard layout, for example, or just a regular desktop keyboard's keyboard layout. So because of that, I had to like remap some keys and do some other like configurations, and I had to like do like I don't think the audio drivers were installed by default, and I don't think there was another one that wasn't installed by default. I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, the Wi-Fi I don't think worked out of the box. So like there was some stuff that like just didn't work that I had to manually install and do myself. Now, if you're using an actual laptop or device with supported hardware, like I did when I just installed it this past week, you won't have those issues. But yeah, that was some kind of hacky workarounds I had to do. So it wasn't necessarily the best first experience of it, but it did run pretty well, and it was, it's lightweight, so that was good. So when I installed it this past week, all that was good to go. The only issue I had was I wanted to do drive encryption. I wanted the install disk to be encrypted. The problem was I had a Windows 11 Pro install also on the same disk, and I had partitioned the drive to make sure so I could dual boot the system. And Arch wasn't happy with that. So I was able to install the operating system fine. But if I tried to encrypt so I guess let me take a step back again. I'm getting ahead of myself. So I installed it the first time, and it went perfectly. But I forgot to do drive encryption. I looked up how to encrypt the drive because I was wondering if it was something like Windows where you install the OS and then you can go and encrypt the drive. I think you kind of can, but it's like super hacky, and it's just better just to, reinstall the OS. And at that point, I didn't have anything on the OS anyway, or really anything configured. So I was like, I'll just wipe it and do it again. But for whatever reason, after I would install it, the bootloader aspect just wouldn't cooperate. Like I would try to boot into it, but it would just prompt me for the password to decrypt the disk, but then I would enter that and it was like, oh yeah, we can't find the disk. And I don't know what happened, to be honest. I tried like 3 or 4 different times. It never worked. And then I figured, you know what? I haven't really done much customization on the Windows side anyway, so I'm just going to wipe the entire drive, Windows included, and start from scratch. So when I did that, everything went off without a hitch. It worked perfectly. I was able to log in after the install with the encrypted drive. Everything worked great. Partitioned the drive, installed Windows, encrypted that drive, and everything's working flawlessly. So all good, but definitely had some hiccups along the way. Now, going back to Arch as an operating system. So Arch has some pros and cons for sure. One of the pros being, like I mentioned previously, is it's the latest and greatest software. It's bleeding edge. Everything's the newest, which, like we mentioned, can be a good thing, and it cannot so much be a good thing, because it's a good thing because if you want to play around with the latest features and if you want the latest software support, like or driver support, I guess. So like if you have some of the latest and greatest hardware, if you want to run Linux on your machine, kind of your only bet is to use Arch or some other like, bleeding edge distro, because if you're using like an LTS release of some other Linux distro like Ubuntu, for example, you have to wait for them to update, the kernel and update the drivers and everything for your hardware to be supported. So if you want that hardware support ASAP and you got some bleeding edge hardware, like, I don't know, a new GPU came out and you just bought it and you want to, put it in your Linux system, kind of your only option is to use Arch, or basically, because that it's going to have the latest kernel, it's going to have the latest driver support and all that good stuff. So in that sense, it's really good for hardware compatibility with the latest and greatest stuff. The other thing to note about Arch is it's what's known as a rolling release. So what that means is you install the operating system once and then you never have to do a reinstall, unless you want to just reinstall it because you want to reinstall it. Or you distro hopped and then you want to go back, so you have to reinstall it. But unless you reinstall the operating system, all you have to do is run a pacman -SYU and your system's up to date. But this is in contrast to other operating systems, more typical operating systems that go on a version cycle. So the difference between the rolling release and the version cycle is the version cycle you can think of as like your Windows 10, Windows 7, Windows 11. There's different versions, and if you want to upgrade to the latest version, while there is like paths to upgrade like within the operating system itself, it's a completely new operating system. Whereas Arch, it's a rolling release, so it's still the same thing. There's no concept of like a Arch 7 or 5.2 or anything like that. It's just Arch. So there, unlike Ubuntu where you got like 20.04 or 22.04 or 21.10 or whatever they got, and then when the new release comes out, you have to upgrade the system, upgrade the version. There's none of that. And to be quite honest, having to do like those version upgrades can be a kind of a pain, and kind of a hassle. So in that sense, it is really nice since you never have to worry about that. Plus, if you're kind of hesitant about using Arch, because like I mentioned, that kind of involved install process of having to type all the commands yourself. Literally, you do that once, and then you never have to do it again. You just do it once, and you're good. So if you're running this, say, in a home lab situation where you have this as a server, which we're going to actually talk about that because, yeah, we're going to talk about that. But if you use, you literally install Arch once in a VM, and then as long as you, keep it up to date with, occasionally like go into the VM and run an update on it, then you can literally clone that drive, that base install of Arch. You just clone that VM to a new VM and you got Arch installed and you didn't have to do any work. So yeah, that is one nice thing with the rolling release model is you install it once, and then as long as you're, running your normal system updates, don't have to worry about upgrading to a new release or anything like that. You're always going to be good to go, which is nice because in the other model with the release versions, after a while, a version is going to be dropped from support, which means it's no longer going to receive feature updates and more more importantly, it's not going to receive any security updates. So that's the thing with the release versioning versus the rolling release. The rolling release, you're always getting feature updates, you're always getting security releases or security updates, you're always getting that stuff. With the version releases, after a certain number of years, you don't get those anymore, and you're forced to upgrade to a newer version. So that's one nice thing about Arch in that sense, is you never have to worry about that. Now, we kind of talked about using it in the home lab, but one thing that when it comes to the home lab, when people talk about using Arch, is like, why would you use Arch in a home lab if it's always on the latest and greatest and can potentially be known to, sometimes cause issues with stability and whatnot because it's so bleeding edge, and, some of those bugs and stuff haven't been ironed out yet. Like in the case, my example I brought up, earlier in the podcast, when I mentioned I installed it on one of my machines and then I ran a system update and then it just wouldn't work anymore. The reason why Arch could be good in a home lab situation is because as long as you only install the base operating system, you're going to be pretty stable if you only have the base operating system installed. So if you and you're not installing any like AUR packages, which the AUR is the Arch user repository, so it's like a separate repository from the main Arch repository of a bunch of different software. The AUR can be... It has some debate on how good it is. Now, there's a lot of software on there that you can install, but it's not like vetted by, I guess, the Arch developers, whatever. Like, it's its own separate thing. So you have to kind of be careful about what you install and all that stuff. But if you're only running the base operating system, it's kind of the idea of, when we talk about running services like in your home lab in general, you want to limit your attack surface, and the best way to do that is limit, what's on your machine, right? Like, you don't want to be running 20 different services all on the same machine, because you're just opening up a lot more vectors and making your attack surface even broader. So if you limit the amount of stuff that's installed, the likelihood of anything not working and breaking is significantly reduced. Plus, if you only have the base install, your footprint is going to be significantly smaller than if you, say, installed like Ubuntu server, for example, that has a bunch of packages already pre-installed on it that you arguably don't even need. So if you run Arch, you could have the base Linux install with literally all that's required to make the operating system bootable and functional, and then you install only the packages that are required to run whatever service you're trying to run. So in a way, it's almost like a container, which you can use Arch in a container too. But if you did want a full-fat VM but a super lightweight one, Arch could definitely be a good option in that sense. Now, as I mentioned, generally you probably, if you wanted to run like a workstation or some other kind of main development machine with Arch, that's where you're going to that's where you start taking more of a risk, because like we mentioned, because it's rolling release, because it's always latest and greatest bleeding edge, you potentially could run into some issues with your software that you would not otherwise run into if you were using, a RedHat or an Ubuntu or a Debian or some other release model version or any other distro that isn't bleeding edge, latest and greatest. Because the difference between, say, Arch versus like Ubuntu is, like I said, Arch is latest and greatest all the time, whereas Ubuntu, it takes a while for the latest and greatest software to be filtered through the system and all the different various checks and everything to get included into the Ubuntu repositories for you to pull down and install on your machine. So this time that happens before you can install the software allows for any of those new bugs or vulnerabilities to be ironed out. So by the time you actually end up installing it, the version of the software is a lot more stable than, when it's first developed. Because anyone that's a software developer out there knows that the first time you write a piece of software and think it's ready to be deployed, you'll soon realize after you start playing around with it, oh yeah, there's a bug here. And then you fix that. Oh yeah, there's another bug here. So then you fix that. And then it takes time before all of the bugs get fully ironed out when you come out with a new feature. It doesn't matter. Like, you can do a ton of testing. You can have great test cases written and all that stuff. But there's going to be some edge cases, or there's going to be something that happens that you weren't able to test for whatever reason. A great example of this is because of the, wide variety of hardware support out there for like operating systems like Linux and Windows and that kind of a thing. Although Windows is potentially could be more stable because Windows has its own thing with drivers, but regardless, hardware limitations or whatever, you obviously, when you're testing your software, you don't have access to every type of hardware that your software is going to be running on. So inevitably, there's going to be some kind of cases that you can't test for. So while as much as we hate to, use the term, oh, it works on my machine, it might actually work on your, like we've talked about with, C and C++ all the time. It might actually work on your machine and not on someone else's. But because depending on how big of a development team you have, or maybe your development team is just you, the amount of devices you can test on is limited. So it might work great and actually, not have any issues, but there might be, a certain GPU or CPU or RAM configuration or something that could potentially cause bugs in your code and not make it function as intended. And that would be something you could potentially run into in Arch because of how latest and greatest and bleeding edge it is. Whereas by the time it would get around to you being able to install it on something like an Ubuntu or something like that, those would have been well ironed out by that point. So that is one thing to keep in mind. If you are using Arch, you could potentially run into some interesting bugs and whatnot in some of the software you use. Although I think there are some packages that you can specify if you want a more stable version or if you want, a more bleeding edge version. But it's not all of them, so just one thing to keep in mind. But again, if you're literally just, say running this as a server, for example, like in your home lab or whatever, and you're only doing the base install plus like a couple packages to run a service, probably not going to be that big of an issue. But again, it's just something that you got to keep in mind, which is, why, RedHat, for example, is so widely used in the enterprise world, because it takes so much time to go through that process of making sure software is good. Like, for context, I believe the version of the Linux kernel that my RedHat install is using, which is the latest 9.1 as the recording of this podcast, I believe it's version 5.14, I want to say, and the version of the Linux kernel running on a Ubuntu machine I have is, I want to say, 5.18, I think. And then the version of the Linux kernel running on my Arch install, I think, is like 6.2. So, yeah, some of the more I guess you could call it stable Linux distros generally lag behind the latest and greatest stuff for this reason, to make sure everything's good, vet it, add a little more layers to the features to make sure that people aren't going to have issues and whatnot. But again, it is fun to play around with the latest and greatest stuff. But yeah, I think that's gonna do it for this episode. But of course, we are not done yet because we have to answer this week's trivia question. So if you'll recall, this week's trivia question is, what C++ revision was the file system library first introduced into the standard C++ library? So if you said 2017 or C++ 17, you are correct. Congratulations. Now, for your information, if you were curious, the file system library technically did exist before C++ 17, but generally, if you wanted to use it, you would have to install a separate library, the Boost library, and then you could get it that way. But it was incorporated into the C++ library in the 2017 revision. So congrats to all of you that got this week's trivia question correct. And if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you would leave it a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also be sure to share with a friend or family member who you think might enjoy it, maybe hearing about Arch Linux, for example. And if you have any questions about this episode or topics you want me to answer for a future episode, feel free to shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. You can also click the link down in the show notes below as well. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.